So if you have a question, we've got this very high-tech phone here. So the number is going to be on the screen throughout. So if you've got a question, if you can text it to this phone, and then we will answer them afterwards. I'm going to invite Adrian up.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Great. Well, we promised to be done by 10 to the hour, so if you do need to get off, then we'll be finished by 10 to. Well, thank you so much for coming to this talk on such a difficult subject. How can a good God allow suffering? Now, perhaps we're asking this question because for many of us, the fact of suffering makes us reluctant to trust the God of the Bible. In a nutshell, I think our question is this: surely if God is all good, he'd want to prevent suffering. And if he's all powerful, he'd be able to stop suffering. So seeing as suffering exists, how can an all-powerful, all-loving God exist? 4 years ago, I faced the hardest situation that I've ever had to deal with. Now, to put this in perspective, don't get me wrong, I've had an easy life. But the period of suffering that myself and my wife Julia went through was harder than everything else in my life put together. Now, I've been struggling with this question for years, but especially since March 2010, I've been asking, why does God allow suffering? I'd like to look at this lunchtime at 4 perspectives on suffering. These are in no particular order. The first of them is free will. Why does God allow suffering? Well, the question presupposes that God exists. What do we suggest that this God should do? Perhaps we think he should have gone for option A and created nothing at all. This, of course, is the ultimate low-risk option. There's no suffering, no one gets hurt. Or perhaps we think he should have gone for option B and created robotic people who are just lifeless machines. There's no feeling, there's no pleasure, there's no pain, there's just metal. This is another no-risk option. But God chooses to go for option C. This is an extremely high-risk alternative. In option C, God chooses to create highly intelligent, spiritual beings like himself, free moral agents who can make real choices just like he can. But the moment he gives them true freedom, he risks the possibility they might choose to reject him. So why on earth would God choose option C? We wouldn't expect him to, because he risks a world of pain if people rebel against him and rebel against each other. So why does he take the risk? What's to be gained by having free will? His answer is genuine love. There is a direct link between free will and love. I discovered this for myself in the summer of 1995 when I fell in love with a marine biologist called Julia Brown. But the whole thrill of it was she chose to love me back. Now, she could very easily have chosen someone else, but she didn't. She chose me. That's why it was and is exciting. Robots can't fall in love. All we are saying is that if God is powerful enough to stop suffering, and then he chooses not to, there presumably must be a reason. I mean, there must be a reason why, in his opinion, at least, he thinks it's worth allowing suffering. His reason is that he is love, and therefore he wants there to be real love in the world. And because he wants real love, that means he wants to give us freedom of choice. Now here, somebody could quite rightly object, hang on a minute, if God is all-powerful, he could still jump in and prevent tragedies like car accidents, for example. But if God jumped in to prevent every accident, then presumably we'd all drive as fast as possible right down the middle of the road in the certain knowledge that we're never going to hit anything. So we've got to at least think through the consequences of what it is that we are asking God to do. Every single time God steps in so that real choices don't have consequences. He reduces our freedom until eventually he'll end up having to jump in every other minute and we're reduced to being robots again with no free will at all. But we still feel that this answer that we're hearing right now as I'm speaking, we feel this isn't good enough. And there are a number of reasons why the answer you're hearing at the moment isn't good enough. Firstly, because we're still hurting. I'm not so stupid as to think that anything that I say today will take away the pain. Second reason we feel this answer isn't good enough is because we still want a world with no suffering. But surely, we're not saying that the only deal that we'd be prepared to accept from God is a world where we can enjoy total freedom to do anything we want, but with no possibility of anyone ever suffering the consequences. Because that would be like holding a gun to God's head and saying, God, the only thing you could ever do to stop me pulling the trigger right now is to create a round square. Not even God can create a round square. Not even God can create a world where we enjoy real freedom but never suffer any of the consequences of our actions. So much suffering is the result of human choice. We read about famine in Africa, and yet then we turn the page in our newspaper and we're told there's enough corn in the American state of Nebraska to feed every starving child in Africa. We read about violent crimes, murders and atrocities. All these things are the result of human choice. And so if you accept that God has given people free will, it becomes easier to understand how human evil follows. Yeah, but we're still hurting. I mean, what's even harder to explain, or to even talk about, I suppose, are natural disasters. For example, an event like the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. Now here an earthquake was to blame. Now, I would not say anything that I'm about to say to somebody who was struggling emotionally with the impact of earthquakes. But let's imagine that you or I, right now, were sent to the library and we had to write an academic report on why the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami happened. The bottom line is that that event happened for one reason. And it is that our planet is made up of absolutely huge tectonic plates that grate against each other. But if it weren't for plate tectonics, we wouldn't be here. There would still be a water world. Without plate tectonics, the continents would never have formed. Now, I know that we all know this, but in the core of the Earth, there's all this hot molten metal in the form of nickel and iron. That creates the Earth's magnetism. The Earth's magnetism is directly connected to the Earth's atmosphere, and both of those things have to be exactly as they are in order for there to be any advanced life or human life on the surface of our planet. However, the metal in the core of the Earth is very, very, very hot, and so there needs to be a system whereby some of that heat can escape. So we have these three forces, all of which we need to have, and the system that keeps those three forces in perfect balance, that lets the heat escape, is earthquakes. Earthquakes, scientists tell us, are essential for there to be any human life on the surface of our planet. Or to put it another way, as astronomer Dr. Hugh Ross of Toronto University puts it, if we do find advanced life on other planets, scientists predict those planets will have plate tectonics. Secondly, plate tectonics are crucial for the preservation of life on Earth because of the burial of material. Plate tectonics is what removes carbon dioxide and water from the atmosphere, which compensates for a huge problem that we have, which is the increasing luminosity of the sun, the fact that the sun is getting brighter and brighter. Thirdly, it turns out that the level of earthquake activity on Earth is finely tuned. Fewer or more earthquakes than we currently have would set the entire balance of our planet off course. We also have exactly the right magnitude and frequency of earthquakes in order for humans to carry on living. Yeah, maybe. But we still wonder, look, couldn't God have done something to warn people that this tidal wave was coming? Well, in this particular case, the technology was available. There was a tsunami warning system off the west coast of the USA. The world's richest nations could have clubbed together and bought one for the Southeast Asian nations. But look, I'm sure you'd agree, there is no getting away from it. There's no escape from it. Natural disasters are appalling. They leave us crying out why. Anybody who isn't deeply moved by the scenes on a TV news screen must have a heart of stone. Another perspective on suffering is that God sometimes works through suffering to bring about good. When I was at school, I had a teacher called Mr. Rosser, and he taught me maths, and he used to listen to my complaints, and then he used to always say the same thing. He used to say, "Holloway, life's tough, rough, and desperately unjust," and then walk away. Now, for some reason, people think the Bible promises sweetness and light. It doesn't. C.S. Lewis said that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Numerous people become Christians as a result of suffering. Clearly, in these circumstances, from their point of view, the pain is worth the gain. In their opinion, 70 years of suffering is outweighed by an eternity in paradise. Next, it brings us to maturity. What do I mean by that? Well, let's imagine that God kept every teenager in the world indoors every Friday night because he wanted to protect them from the pain of hangovers and broken hearts. If he did, there'd be a global riot because people all over the world are grateful for the freedom to go out at the weekend. Could it be that equal doses of freedom and suffering are needed for us to become mature enough to enjoy life to the full? It's interesting and it's surprising to me that most Christians seem to have had their faith strengthened by suffering. If the fact of suffering really was such a knockout argument that it actually disproves the existence of the Christian God, I've always wondered, why don't more Christians quit? Why does suffering seem to have the opposite effect? Next, Christians are so often a driving force in aid agencies which are fighting to relieve suffering all around the world, as even a casual glance through the history books will show. Also, we won't always see what God is up to. Let me take an example from my own childhood. When I was a child, I thought the dentist's really was a torture chamber. I mean, it was all face masks and needles. I was forced to go in there by adults. They then literally held me down in the chair. I screamed with pain as loud as I could as a man in a white coat drilled into me. The more I screamed, the more I genuinely thought he was enjoying it. As far as I was concerned, he was attacking me. I had no idea that the pain was going to turn out to be worth the gain, because I had a child's perspective on pain. What if we're like that child and God is like the dentist? For all we know, a loving God might allow some suffering because he's actually doing us a favour. I mean, life can be like that sometimes, can't it? I certainly know I've gone through painful times, only many years later to realise, look, actually something really good did come through that. Next, God is not immune from suffering. I wouldn't want anyone to get the impression that Christians are somehow trying to get God off the hook for suffering. Because the fact is, God has put himself on the hook. God has put himself on the cross. Have you ever heard the poem, The Long Silence? It goes like this. At the end of time, billions of people were scattered on a great plain before God's throne. Most shrank back from the brilliant light before them, but some groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame, but with belligerence. Could God judge us? How can he know about suffering? Snapped a young girl. And she ripped open her sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. We endured terror, she said, beatings, torture, death, she said. In another group, a young man lowered his collar. What about this? He said, showing an ugly rope burn. Lynched for no crime but being black. In another crowd, a pregnant schoolgirl with sullen eyes. Why should I suffer? She murmured. Wasn't my fault. Far out across the plain, there were hundreds of such groups. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering that he had allowed in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven where all is sweetness and light, where there's no weeping or hunger or hatred or fear. What did God know of all that man had been forced to endure in the world? For God leads a pretty sheltered life, they said. So each of these groups sent forth their leader, chosen because he or she had suffered most. A Jew, someone from Hiroshima, horribly deformed arthritic, a thalidomide child, and in the centre of the plain they consulted with each other, and at last they were ready to present their case. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they'd endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. Let him be born a Jew, they said. Let the legitimacy of his birth be doubted, they said. Give him a work to do that's so difficult that when he tries to do it, even his family will think that he's out of his mind, they said. Let him then be betrayed by his closest friends. Let him face false charges. Let him be tried by a prejudiced jury and then convicted by a cowardly judge. Then let him be tortured, they said, flogged, scourged with a whip, mocked, spat at. Then let him be totally alone, deserted, and then in extreme agony, let him die, they said. As each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the throng of people assembled. And when the last had finished pronouncing sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered another word. No one moved, for suddenly all knew that God had already served his sentence. The Christian answer to suffering is a person. It's not really an answer as such. It's Jesus. Sometimes words aren't enough. Hey, if I am suffering, listening to a 20-minute talk is not what I'm looking for. Because I have a personal problem, I need a personal answer. But as it happens, God is a someone and not a something. In that sense, when we do think about the worst moments of our lives, Jesus has been there. Are you broken? Jesus was broken on the cross. Are you rejected by your friends? Jesus was rejected by his friends. Are you hated for no good reason? Jesus was hated for no good reason. And when we cry out and we complain that we can't take it anymore, we can think of Jesus being killed on the cross, crying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is more than an explanation. Jesus is a person. And you know what? If, while I'm here in Newcastle this week, I hear on the phone that my wife and my 4 kids in London died this morning in a car crash, I don't know if I'll ever find in this life an adequate explanation for why that happened. But I do believe that God has left me with something more satisfying than an explanation. God has left me with Jesus. And maybe you're here today and when all is said and done, you know what? Something evil happened to you. I know that nothing that's been said today will take away the pain. It's also true that something evil happened on a hill outside Jerusalem in around 33 AD when an innocent man called Jesus of Nazareth was murdered. But God did bring something beautiful out of that tragedy. God allowed the suffering of his own son because he knew it that something wonderful could be achieved. At the time, Jesus' disciples thought it was a disaster. Their heroes being executed, all their hopes and dreams were in tatters. They had no idea that through dying on the cross, Jesus was solving the biggest problem that they had. He was solving the biggest problem that I have, the problem of sin. Fourthly, finally, and very briefly, God more than compensates for our suffering. I mean, can any of us begin to imagine how wonderful 70 billion years of ecstasy will be? Living in a place where every day is better than the one before? Anyway, those are 4 perspectives on suffering. And at the end of this talk, somebody says, Adrian, thanks, but it's just not good enough. As it happens, I agree. But it seems to me that at the cross of Christ, we can see why a God of love could allow suffering. Because firstly, we see the results of human freedom in that decision. Just going back over our 4 points. It was human decisions that put Jesus on the cross. There were these 70 men called the Sanhedrin. They made a decision to deliberately deny Jesus a fair trial. There was this other man called Pontius Pilate. He made a decision to have Jesus flogged and crucified, even though Jesus hadn't actually committed any crime. We see the results of human freedom in that evil decision to kill an innocent man. Secondly, we see God working through suffering. Because when Jesus was dying, God seemed to have deserted him. But actually, everything that happened on that day had been planned by God centuries before. And in the Old Testament, a series of books, all of which had been finished and completed 400 years before Jesus was even born, there are loads of predictions about what would happen that day. For example, that the Messiah would be betrayed by a friend, in this case Jesus, that's Psalm 41 verse 9. That the Messiah would be struck and spat upon, Isaiah 50 verse 6. The price that would be paid to betray Jesus, the 30 pieces of silver, that's predicted in Zechariah 11:12. In the next verse it talks about what happens to the money after that, as if it matters what happens. Actually it's used to buy a potter's field. Virtually the whole of Psalm 22 is full of predictions about what's going to happen to Jesus on that day. The soldiers, for example, in verse 17, it's predicted, this is 900 years before the event, that the soldiers would cast lots for his clothing at the foot of the cross while he's being crucified. Now my point is that the suffering was real, the injustice is real, but it was all planned. Jesus fulfilled 29 prophecies on that single day, the day that he died. On that day at least, God was working through suffering. Thirdly, on the cross we see that God is not immune from suffering. He suffered too. And as I close, I think this is the most helpful point of all. If Christianity is true, then the God who really exists can relate to what I'm going through. I think I can worship a God who saw the drama of human suffering and in response decided to dive in and suffer too. Fourthly, on the cross we see that God more than compensates for our suffering. Could it be that one day, from your vantage point in heaven, you will say, looking back, actually, it was all worth it? Could it be that one day from heaven, you'll look back through all the pain and the tears, the relationship breakups, the physical pain? Could it be from a place in heaven, you will say, you know what, now I can see the big picture, I think it's true. God has more than compensated for my suffering. So in conclusion, we don't have a God who just folds his arms and looks down impassively at human suffering. No, we have a God who saw how bad it was and dived in and suffered with us. We have a suffering God. In fact, we have a crucified God. You've been very patient listening to me on this very difficult subject. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you have a chance to fill the cards in. Thanks, Adrian, for that talk. So I've had some messages coming through. So we'll rattle through some of these questions. There's a couple of questions that have had a similar theme. You talked about suffering through human choice and human actions. But what about suffering from action, from things outside of our control, such as disease. Does God have a message? And if we were designed in God's image, how can some of us be designed with a self-destructing health without any cause or reason?
Okay, well, those are two very good questions. I think they're similar, but also slightly different. On the first one, it would probably be quite helpful to go through a whole series of different categories of things, so different diseases, different, first of all, natural disasters, tornadoes. We've talked a little bit about earthquakes and so on. That would probably take up all of the question time. I mean, let me say, if this is your question, I have got quite an exhaustive academic thing that goes through all the different types of naturally occurring evils with a response on each of them. So it might be your question is particularly about a particular bacteria or a particular insect or a particular parasite or a particular weather pattern, and there are responses, I think, on all of these. It does seem as if some of these things obviously fit into a larger pattern. So if you were to take away, I don't know, tornadoes, you create other problems that make it difficult for humans to live on Earth. I would say that one of the key things that perhaps we need to think about is that from our point of view, let's just make it easier. From my point of view, if I were God, if you'll forgive me, if I were God, my natural inclination might be to maximize human happiness in this life. So I might set up the world in such a way so that the greatest number of people are happy as they possibly can be, in between the time when they're born and the time when they die, when they're maybe 80 or 90 years old, and that would be my goal. But in the Bible, that isn't God's ultimate goal. God's ultimate goal is that the greatest number of people would be with him in heaven. And so it might be that if there was slightly less suffering in the world than there is, or if there was slightly more suffering than there is in the world, that fewer people would come to know him. And so it could be that God sets the amount of suffering at a certain point, which means the greatest number of people turn to him and freely choose him and enjoy him forever. So if that is the case, then all sorts of things might happen on earth, or God might allow things to happen, because from his point of view, he's got morally sufficient reasons for allowing the suffering and evil, even though from our point of view, we're thinking, well, how can that possibly be fair? Particularly, don't you think, because it would all be a lot easier, wouldn't it? In fact, the seminar would be a lot easier if, let's say that suffering does exist, but at least if it was proportionate. If the people who are the most selfish and the most awful, in our opinion, if they suffered the most in this life, and then the people who seem to be the best kind of people and the nicest, if they suffered the least, the whole thing would be slightly more easy to cope with emotionally in this life. But that isn't the case, is it? So something appears to be arbitrary and random. However, from God's point of view, he's living outside of time-space. It might be he has morally sufficient reasons for allowing suffering, even though we don't see it in this life. A bit like I said, if my wife and kids die in a car crash, would I have any reason to think that before I die, I would discover why that happened? Certainly there's nothing in the Bible that promises me, oh yeah, when you're 78 years old, I will send you a message and explain exactly why she had to die on that day and what the point of it all is. So we're not promised that. We are promised that God will more than compensate for our suffering, and that one day there's going to be a judgment day when every wrong is righted. And on that judgment day, all the unreported crimes, all the people that seem to have got away with it, all the people who annoy us the most, who appear to have got away with murder, literally, we'll find actually no one got away with anything. That nobody will be suffering more harshly, or nobody will be let off more lightly than they deserve. So that's a great couple of questions, and I think I've maybe tried to answer the first of them, but I'm sure we've got lots of others.
Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask now from that?
Yeah. So just what you're saying about like the ultimate judgment, that makes it sound as if people who do good things will be rewarded and people who do bad things will be punished. But that's not actually what the Bible says. The Bible says that even the person who does the worst thing, they will have, best rewards as long as they turn back to God. And the person that does so many great things but doesn't turn back to God
Very good. Sorry, what's your name?
Eve.
Eve, you're absolutely right. If I gave you, or gave anyone the impression that I was saying that actually on Judgment Day, people who behave well will be rewarded with heaven, but those who won't be, you're absolutely right, Eve. I've just completely misrepresented what the Bible says. So I think your question then is, okay, if the Bible does say that it's not just people who are, quote, good who get to go to heaven and those who are, quote, bad who don't, that actually, according to the Bible, the truth is that none of us are good enough. So yeah, I think we'd all agree that Adolf Hitler wasn't good enough for heaven. I think we kind of buy into that. That's fairly easy to get our heads around. But the Bible says that actually all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's not just one or two spectacularly, quote, evil people. Therefore, we've got to try and understand if nobody deserves heaven, if that really is the case, that all of us deserve eternity without God, the amazing thing, the scandalous thing, is that anybody gets forgiven. If we're not good enough for God, it's amazing that he's provided a totally good person, in this case Jesus Christ, and therefore his love is that if we can just trust in him, because he is good enough for God, we put our trust in him, and because he's good enough, we're acceptable to God by placing ourselves in Christ. So this is an amazing idea. It's counterintuitive. It's different from everything that we would expect. First of all, it sounds much worse than we could possibly imagine, that none of us are good enough for God. Then it sounds much better than it could possibly be, because all we have to do is trust in one perfectly good person, and we can be acceptable to God. So I'm not sure if we're still broadcasting, but yeah. So there's my answer, or the start of an answer in terms of that very good question.